Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are going to be talking about 5 things that you should never do in your manual transmission car. These 5 things that I've listed are extremely essential and we end up doing this subconsciously, not realizing that we are damaging internal components of our cars, internal components of our gearbox, our clutch plate and our flywheel. We are damaging these things without realizing when we are doing certain things in our car, and we are going to be talking about all of them in this video. I decided to make this video because a lot of us in India at least drive manual cars and we don't realize that we do a lot of things subconsciously. So stay till the end and watch these 5 points, because the 5 points that I cover, I'm sure will make you realize that there are these certain aspects that even you are doing and not realizing how they are damaging your car in the long run. But before that guys, I would like to tell you all that if you are here for the first time, make sure to subscribe to the channel because we make a ton of automobile related content. We talk about automobile news, reviews, tech, anything and everything related to automobile. So make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're an automobile enthusiast or if you want to know and gain some automobile related knowledge. Also guys, the Motoring Gossip family is growing bigger and bigger in different social media platforms, and we have recently come out with this new Motoring Gossip logo t-shirt, and we have Motoring Gossip at the back as well. Make sure to check them out on our website. They're going to be available on our website for sale, and let me know if you all want to be one of the lucky people to win one of these t-shirts in the giveaway. Enough of self promotion, let's get right to this video and let's get started. The first thing that I want to tell you all is that you all should never rest your arm on the gear lever whilst you all are driving. So say for example, you're on the 3rd gear or the 4th gear, the 5th gear, and you have made your gear change and you're going to be in this gear for some time and you're driving on the expressway, freeway for a while and you're not going to be changing gears. You remove your hand from the gear lever. Don't rest your hand on the gear lever. This is a very bad practice. Before I get into explaining to you all what exactly internally is getting damaged, I'm going to first tell you all about different options of what you all can do instead. If you are doing some performance driving, for example, shift the gear and put your hand on the steering wheel immediately. The reason for this is when you're doing some performance driving, your hand should always be on the steering wheel. So you shift your gear and you put your hand back on the steering wheel. You require hands to be on the steering wheel because you need to have all the possible control of the steering wheel when doing some performance driving. But say you're just doing some relaxed driving and you're on the highway and you're just cruising along. What do? Well, in many cars you have your armrest that comes out here. When you have your armrest that comes out here, you can rest your hand on the armrest. But remember, after you switch the gear, remove your hand from the gear. Do not touch the gear at any possible time when your car is in motion and you don't need to shift the gear. As soon as you need to shift the gear, put your hand in and shift the gear. But then remove your hand from the gear lever. What I do, because the Ford Freestyle does not have a armrest, is I keep my right hand on this armrest on the door and I hold the steering wheel with this hand. By doing this as a practice, I always shift the gear and put my hand back on the steering wheel. As a practice, I never touch the gear lever. The reason for never touching the gear lever is the gear lever is attached to a selecting fork. Now this fork comes in contact with a rotating collar that selects the gear. So as soon as you shift the gear, the fork moves and touches and comes in contact with the rotating collar. The rotating collar is rotating at all times and it shifts the gear for you. So there's a stagnant object which comes in contact with a rotating object as soon as you shift the gear, and every time you do that, this contact causes a slight amount of wear. The design of the fork and the rotating collar has been designed to take that certain amount of wear. But if you rest the hand on the gear lever, you are moving the fork unrealizingly. The fork comes closer and starts coming in contact with the rotating collar. This will cause for wear and tear of the rotating collar and the fork as well. If you have a look at the owner's manual, they also mention that the gear lever should not be used as an armrest, and that by using the gear lever as an armrest, you're causing premature wear of the transaxle selector fork. Point number 1 is never rest your hand on the gear when the car is in drive. Change the gear and remove your hand from the gear lever. That brings us to point number 2. When you come to a stop signal or a red light, put your car into the neutral, remove your left leg from the clutch and take your right leg and put it on the brake. What is really important out here is that you don't leave your car in gear when you're at a stop signal. Because if you leave your car in gear at a stop signal, your clutch is going to be pressed. Because if you're in gear, that means your clutch is going to be pressed. And if your clutch is pressed, that means your throughout valve is getting blown off. To explain to you all what a throughout valve is, I need to show this diagram of the clutch and how it works in contact with the supply of power that's coming from the engine and the transmission side. The rotating force that's coming from the engine side is rotating the flywheel and has to send that power to the other side, which is the transmission and the drive wheels, which will take the power to the driving wheels. And within this contraption on the other side, what we have is a pressure plate, and housed inside the pressure plate is the clutch plate. Now every time we push the clutch, the throughout bearing pushes against the pressure plate, releasing the clutch. and every time the clutch is released, it loses contact with the flywheel, and that lets us shift gears. As soon as we release off the clutch pedal, the clutch touches against the flywheel and starts rotating the transmission in the same speed as the crankshaft, which is coming from the engine. So having explained all this to you all, what happens is that the throwout bearing is coming in contact with the pressure plate. Now the pressure plate is still rotating at idle speed. So now what's going to happen is when you stop at a signal, your throwout bearing is going to get worn off because it's going to come in contact with the pressure plate. The pressure plate is now rotating at idle speed, which is 800 RPM. So supposing you stop at a signal and your wheels have stopped rotating and you're idling, you're not putting any pressure on the accelerator, your engine is going to idle at 800 RPM. Now whilst it's rotating at 800 RPM, your pressure plate inside is rotating at that speed, and your throw-off bearing, which is coming in contact with the pressure plate, is now getting worn off as a result. So that is why, to prevent the throw-off bearing from getting worn off, you need to make sure that you get the car into neutral and put your foot on the brake and wait at the signal. It might be a small signal where your car would be in the gear for that brief amount of time. That is fine. It's not a life-changing thing for a few seconds if you have the clutch engaged while you're stopped. It's not going to change a lot. A slight wear of tire is what it's designed for. So that is why when you're stopped at a signal and you're going to be stopped for a very long time, make sure to put the car in neutral, remove your leg from the clutch. That will not only provide a relaxation period for your leg, but it will also prevent the throw-off bearing from wearing out. Now many of you all will tell me that, it is better for us to have a foot on the clutch just in case we want to release and get started, or if somebody rear ends us, it's better to have a foot on the clutch. But the fact is that if you're going to get rear ended while you stopped at a signal, your foot has to be on the brake at all point of time. As soon as you stop, you cannot have your car in neutral and not your handbrake on. If that's the case, your foot always has to be on the brake. And if you're stopped at a signal for a very long time, it's always good to also put your handbrake on. Now that brings us to the third point. Now many times people, when they're on a slight incline, what they do is they find that sweet spot between releasing the clutch and a slight acceleration, which prevents the car from rolling back, but you are still at a stop position. That's called a sweet spot. Is actually very bad for your clutch plate. You see, what happens is that the clutch is rotating at the same speed as the transmission. So your clutch is now stagnant, whilst your car engine, the flywheel, is still rotating. And because that's still rotating, you're actually burning off the friction material on the clutch plate. So many times, even I myself have not realized when I do this, and I find it quite interesting to do that. When I'm at a slight inclination, I'm in the first gear, I have the clutch ever so slightly removed and the accelerator slightly pressed, where the car is not going backwards, but it's still at an inclination and it is holding. That's because the clutch is really taking the blame for all of this and taking all the pain, and it's wearing off your clutch. That's going to cost you a very expensive clutch in the future. There are 3 solutions of how you could overcome this problem. Now many modern day cars come with something called as hill assist. Now this hill assist basically helps you on a hill inclination. For example, when you're at an inclination, the car realizes that you're at a tilt. What it does, it helps you get off the brake and put your leg on the accelerator. When you're on the first gear and you are about to release your right leg from the brake and go on to the accelerator, what happens is that the brakes will continue to hold the car in the same position and let you shuffle your right leg to the accelerator so that you can start moving forward. But many cars don't come with hill assist. So what do you do then? Well, if you're at a gentle slope, what I would recommend is that when you're on the first gear, you leave off the clutch very slightly, and as soon as you start feeling the car pulling a little bit ahead, you press the accelerator and you let the car go a little bit more ahead. Don't find that sweet spot of when you've half released the clutch and stay in that spot for too long. Stay there and then quickly move your leg from the brake to the accelerator and give a little bit more accelerator and let the car move ahead. That will prevent the car from rolling back. The other option, and the most common one I would recommend, is that use your handbrake or your e-brake. So have the handbrake up, and whilst you have the handbrake up, release the clutch slowly and ever so slightly start pressing the accelerator. When you feel your car trying to push a little bit forward, you put the handbrake down and the car will start moving ahead. These are the other options that you could use to make sure clutch doesn't get worn off, because clutch aren't cheap and they'll be very expensive to replace later. That brings us to a fourth point, and a very important point, because we do this unrealizingly. What happens is that many times when we are cruising on the expressway in the 5th gear, once we reach the 5th gear, we end up removing our leg from the clutch but not realizing that our left leg is still resting on the clutch. Why this is so bad is because what we aren't realizing, that if our leg is resting on the clutch pedal, what's happening is that the clutch plate is slightly coming in contact with the flywheel. This is going to reduce the friction material on the clutch, and you're going to have to replace the clutch very soon. You're also not getting the full potential of the engine power to the transmission and to the driving wheels because you're slightly pressing the clutch. What's happening is that many a times you are using the clutch pedal as a rest for your left leg, which is extremely bad. Many times in many cars, automobile manufacturers give you a dead pedal to rest your left leg when you are not using the clutch, and it is extremely important that you all use it. Even if you all don't have a dead pedal, like in this Ford Freestyle, I do not have a dead pedal, but I have to make sure that I remove my leg from the clutch and I keep it on the side. Every time I want to engage the clutch again, I have to lift my leg up and press it all the way down. If I don't press it all the way down, I'm again going to be half clutching, which is going to extremely be bad for the clutch pedal, because it's going to come in slight contact with the flywheel and not a complete contact with the flywheel, which is going to ruin your clutch plate again. So that's two things in this point, which is one, when you're in drive and you're happily sitting in a gear, do not half press the clutch or do not rest your left leg on the clutch, because that will really wear off your clutch plate very faster. The friction material on the clutch plate which comes in contact with the flywheel will get worn off very fast. And the second thing is, when you're clutching, you have to make sure that you are sitting in a position that your knee is arched and it completely engages what's getting pressed. You don't only use your feet to clutch, you have to use the knee power as well. So you have to be in a driving position that's not too far away from the clutch, because it's always good, press the clutch pedal completely. Make sure that the clutch plate is engaged completely before you shift gears, because if you don't, you're going to not only ruin your gearbox, but you're also going to be ruining your clutch plate. Now that brings us to the last point. You should never press the clutch in fully when you're at a high gear at low RPMs. Let me explain. When you're cruising on the highway on the 5th gear and you're say at 30-40 kilometers per hour and you're just like at 1000, 1500 RPM, and you decide that you want to overtake the person in front of you, there's no point pressing the accelerator down completely hoping for power. That is actually lugging your engine and it's actually bad for the engine. See, what happens is that when you're expecting the engine to give you more power at a low RPM, at a high gear, that's not possible, and you're confusing the engine or you're creating a conflict. Your car is basically at a gearing disadvantage. You see, lower gears are bigger in size and they give you more torque and less power. But as you go higher, the gears become smaller in size, give you more power and less torque. Right now, when you want to overtake the person in front of you, you require torque. And when you put your foot down, you're not going to be able to get that power because you're at a very high ratio and a very high gear. What was required to be done is for you to shift from the 5th gear and go to the 3rd gear and then release the clutch, and then will you get power. If you don't do this, you'll be confusing the engine and the engine will not be able to deliver. And this expectation of power that you're expecting the engine to do, you're putting your foot down completely, expecting more power to come out, is not happening because it cannot coordinate with the gear. It's at a gearing disadvantage. So in my opinion, do not be lazy. Shift down to the 3rd gear. Make sure you rev match obviously and shift down to the 3rd gear, and you will be able to get that power. This is not a very big deal, but this is a very bad thing for your engine, and in the long run it will really backfire. So in my opinion, don't be lazy. Just shift down to the 3rd gear when you want that power. Also remember, when you're shifting from the 5th to the 3rd or from the 5th to the 2nd, make sure you rev match, because your RPM that your engine is at and the RPM that your gears are at are not in line and not in sync. So if you're shifting from the 5th to the 3rd because you want that spot on power, you have to make sure that you rev match. I'll make another long video on what is rev match and why it's very important, because you will be damaging so many more components if you manage to not rev match. You have to understand that your engine speed has a different speed and your transmission speed is a different speed. You have to make sure that these synchronize before you shift gears, and every time you shift gear there's a slight change. But when you're shifting gears drastically in a manual from 5th to 3rd or 5th to 2nd, you're getting a lot of more torque suddenly. You have to make sure that this rev match happens before you actually shift. Otherwise the speeds that both of them are rotating at is different, and that will give you that jhatka when you shift down. So don't be lazy, shift down to the 3rd gear when you want that power, but remember, slightly rev match. Anyway guys, that was it for this video. Though the 5 points in my opinion that are extremely important for every owner of a manual car to know when you're driving a car, because it's extremely essential, and we take many of these things for granted, which will come back and bite us only in the long run, because we'll have to change the clutch plate or we'll have to change the flyout bearing, and these things aren't cheap. You will have to surely spend money and shell out money to replace them. So make sure that you use your equipment perfectly. It is your baby after all, and it is your car. So make sure you clutch properly. Make sure if your driver is driving, make sure that they also clutch properly. You don't rest their legs on the clutch when you're in a cruising speed, because many times drivers do this and it's not theirs, so they don't really care. But make sure that your driver or anybody else who drives your car is clutching properly, is not resting the leg on the clutch, is not resting their hand on the gear lever. These are extremely important things. I hope you all found this video informative. If you all did, make sure to like this video and share it to friends and family, because it will help somebody somewhere or the other and will make a big difference to their driving style. Anyway guys, subscribe to the channel and let me know what video you all would like me to make in the future, and let me know in the comment section and we'll make a video on that pretty soon. Till then, stay safe, happy motoring, cheers.